Hello, friends. Today, I'd like to introduce you to Kyle. Kyle was 58 years old when we began working together, and like so many people, he wasn't dealing with just one symptom. He was struggling with low energy, weight gain, brain fog, and episodes of dizziness. Individually, none of these symptoms are unusual, but together, they start to suggest that something deeper may be affecting how the body is functioning. As a functional health practitioner, I don't begin by asking which supplement matches this symptom or what protocol should I put Kyle on. I start by asking what's driving this pattern. And sometimes the answer is nutrition, sometimes it's gut health, sometimes it's chronic inflammation or impaired detoxification. And sometimes the body has been quietly accumulating chemicals from everyday life that interfere with normal physiology. In Kyle's case, this turned out to be an important part of the story. So today I'm going to walk you through the laboratory findings and explain what xenoestrogens are. I'll show you how I used the results to help build a personalized recovery plan for Kyle. Because when you understand why someone is experiencing symptoms, you can begin making decisions that are based on biology instead of guesswork. So, what exactly are xenoestrogens? Before we look at Kyle's laboratory results, let's talk about what xenoestrogens actually are. Xenoestrogens are synthetic chemicals that can mimic or interfere with the actions of estrogen in the body. Even though they're not natural hormones, some of them can bind to estrogen receptors or alter hormone signaling in ways that affect normal physiology. They're surprisingly common. They're found in certain plastics, food packaging, the thermal receipts that you get from stores, pesticides, personal care products, fragrances, cleaning products, in some pharmaceutical drugs, and many other everyday items. Most people are exposed to them regularly without realizing it. And the concern isn't usually one single exposure, it's the cumulative effect of many small exposures over years or even decades. Research has associated xenoestrogen exposure with changes in hormone balance, metabolism, body weight, reproductive health, and other biological systems. They can also contribute to oxidative stress, inflammation, and place additional demands on the body's detoxification pathways. Now, that doesn't mean that every symptom is caused by xenoestrogen. Of course not. But when someone has ongoing, unexplained health problems, they become one of the many factors worth investigating. So the question becomes, was Kyle carrying an unusually high burden of these chemicals? That's exactly what his laboratory testing was designed to help answer. After reviewing Kyle's health history, I recommended environmental toxin testing. And one of the things that stood out was his xenoestrogen profile. Rather than finding just one elevated chemical, we found multiple hormone disrupting compounds. These included chemicals such as BPA, several phthalates, parabens, and nonylphenol. While each has its own sources and biological effects, they all have one thing in common: they can interfere with normal hormone signaling. And this is important because the body doesn't experience these chemicals one at a time, it experiences the total burden. Imagine trying to have a conversation in a quiet room. one radio turns on, then another, then a television, then someone starts vacuuming. Hormones work in much the same way. They're chemical messengers, and when outside chemicals begin mimicking or disrupting these signals, the body's communication network can become less efficient. Now, I'm not saying these laboratory findings explain every one of Kyle's symptoms. Biology is rarely that simple, but they provided an important clue that environmental exposures deserve to be part of his recovery plan. The next question was, where were these chemicals coming from and what were they doing inside the body? Seeing several xenoestrogens elevated on a laboratory report doesn't necessarily mean each one is causing a specific symptom. As I mentioned, that's not really how biology works. Instead, I look at the overall pattern. Kyle wasn't carrying just one hormone disrupting chemical. He had evidence of exposure to multiple compounds, each capable of affecting the body in different ways. Together, they suggested a significant environmental burden that deserved attention. Many xenoestrogens can bind to estrogen receptors or interfere with hormone signaling. Others influence the enzymes involved in hormone metabolism or increase oxidative stress and inflammation. Some have been associated with changes in insulin sensitivity, fat storage, thyroid function, and mitochondrial activity or energy. So when I looked at Kyle's symptoms, low energy, weight gain, brain fog, and dizziness, they weren't enough on their own to tell me what might be wrong. But when I combined his health history, past labs with these labs, the picture became much clearer. The goal wasn't simply to identify chemicals. The goal was to understand how those exposures might be affecting the biological systems responsible for producing his symptoms. That's where the investigation moved next. Were these laboratory findings reflected in other areas of Kyle's testing? Up to this point, we had identified multiple xenoestrogens that could interfere with normal hormone signaling, but the laboratory testing didn't stop there. One of the questions I always ask is, how is the body responding? And that's where the gut zoomer became valuable. Rather than looking for a single infection or one bad bug, this test evaluates the overall function of the gastrointestinal tract, including inflammation, digestive capacity, the balance of the microbiome, and the metabolites produced by the beneficial bacteria. Kyle's report didn't point to one obvious cause for his symptoms. Instead, it showed several patterns that suggested his digestive system was under stress. There were findings associated with metabolic dysfunction, liver health, and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO. These aren't diagnoses by themselves, but they are clues that the gut ecosystem isn't functioning optimally. And this is an important concept because the body doesn't work in isolated compartments. The digestive system influences nutrient absorption, immune regulation, hormone metabolism, and the elimination of many environmental chemicals. So when I looked at Kyle's environmental testing alongside these gut findings, I wasn't seeing two separate problems. I was seeing different pieces of the same biological story. The next step was to identify which of these gut findings would have the greatest impact on his recovery. Among all of the information in the Gutzoomer report, two findings stood out to me. The first was an elevated MMP9. MMP9 is an enzyme involved in tissue remodeling and inflammation. When it's elevated in the gastrointestinal tract, it suggests that the intestinal lining is experiencing inflammatory stress. Kyle's value was 3 times higher than the upper reference range, making it one of the most significant abnormalities in the report. The second finding was a low pancreatic elastase level. Pancreatic elastase is a marker of the pancreas's ability to produce digestive enzymes. When enzyme production begins to decline, the body may have more difficulty breaking down food and efficiently absorbing nutrients. Kyle's results was below the laboratory's reference range, suggesting reduced digestive capacity. Now, think about everything we've already learned. We had evidence of multiple environmental chemicals capable of disrupting normal physiology, and now we had evidence that the digestive system itself wasn't functioning optimally. These findings don't prove that one caused the other, but together they painted a picture of a body under chronic biological stress. And that changed the focus of the recovery plan. The priority became supporting the biological systems responsible for digestion, nutrient absorption, and recovery while reducing the overall environmental burden. Because when those foundational systems improve, many symptoms often begin to improve with them. Once I had completed Kyle's assessment and reviewed all of his laboratory findings, the goal was to address the biological systems that appeared to be under the greatest stress, as I mentioned earlier. So that meant reducing ongoing environmental exposures like BPA education, wherever practical, supporting digestive function, improving nutrient absorption, and creating the conditions for the body to recover. At the same time, we looked at nutrition, daily habits, sleep, movement, and other lifestyle factors that influence how well the body repairs and regulates itself. This is one of the reasons I don't believe there's a single supplement or protocol that works for everyone. Two people can arrive with similar symptoms but require very different plans because the underlying biology is different. Kyle's laboratory testing helped identify where support was most needed, allowing us to prioritize interventions instead of relying on trial and error. The goal was to improve the biological foundations that support energy production, digestion, hormone regulation, and overall resilience. And that's exactly what we monitored as we worked together over the following months. So what happened after the plan was put into place? This is where people often expect dramatic overnight results. That wasn't Kyle's experience. Recovery from long-standing biological stress is usually a process, not an event. Over the next several months, we stayed in close contact through regular follow-up visits and progress assessments. We weren't simply repeating the same recommendations each month. We were watching how his body responded, identified what was helping, what wasn't, and adjusted the plan accordingly. One of the advantages of ongoing follow-up is that it allows you to respond to the patient's biology instead of assuming the original plan should never change. And as improvements occur, priorities shift. As new challenges appear, we address those as well. And this is one of the reasons I don't believe laboratory testing is the finish line. It helps us to decide where to begin. The real work happens afterward, observing the patient's response and making thoughtful decisions based on how they're actually doing. So let's look at what Kyle began reporting during those follow-up visits. By this point, we had moved beyond laboratory results. Now we wanted to know whether the biological changes we were targeting were beginning to translate into meaningful improvements in Kyle's day-to-day life. A laboratory test provides a snapshot in time. A patient's progress tells us whether we're moving in the right direction. So at each follow-up, we reviewed Kyle's symptoms, his progress, his consistency with the plan, and any new concerns that had developed. We adjusted the plan based on his response, rather than assuming the original recommendations should remain unchanged. And this is an important distinction and why I mention it again. Recovery isn't measured by one laboratory value or one symptom. It's measured by the overall trajectory. Is energy gradually improving? Is mental clarity becoming more consistent? Is digestion functioning better? Is the patient able to tolerate more activity than before? Those are the kinds of changes that tell us whether the body is becoming more resilient. Kyle's progress wasn't defined by one dramatic breakthrough. It was the accumulation of many smaller improvements over time that suggested we were moving in the right direction. By February, we'd been working together for approximately 3 months. As I reviewed Kyle's next progress report, one thing immediately stood out. Life had happened. He had re-injured a herniated disc and significantly affected his mobility and also caused him severe pain. So this new injury became a major obstacle during his recovery. But even with this setback, there were encouraging signs. Kyle continued to report improved mental clarity and flexibility before the back injury occurred. His bowel function remained improved, and he described regularity as one of the accomplishments that he was most proud of. When we compared his symptom ratings with those from December, several areas had moved in the right direction. Sleep improved substantially, brain fog and mental clarity improved, body pain related to his original condition improved, although the herniated disc introduced a new challenge for Kyle. Digestive symptoms remained low, and bowel function continued to be stable. And to me, this illustrates an important principle. Recovery doesn't occur in a straight line. People continue living their lives. They catch illnesses, experience injuries, deal with stress, and face unexpected obstacles. The goal isn't to create a life where nothing ever goes wrong, though that would be nice, but the goal is to improve the body's overall resilience so that when challenges do occur, there is a stronger biological foundation to recover from them. Kyle's story wasn't perfect, but despite encountering an entirely new problem, many of the improvements we had already seen were still present. And that's exactly the kind of long-term trend I hope to see when working with someone. One of the reasons I like following patients over time is that they often describe changes that don't fully show up on a laboratory report. And as I listened to Kyle about his progress, I wasn't just looking at numbers. I was hearing someone describe how everyday life had changed. Kyle told me that before beginning this program, he struggled with mobility. He had difficulty getting off the couch and moving around. He had shortness of breath, and there were times he felt like he might pass out just standing in the kitchen. By this point, he told me those problems had subsided dramatically. His sleep had also improved, and instead of waking repeatedly during the night, he described sleeping through until morning much more consistently. His energy wasn't perfect, but he said it was definitely better than before. And what impressed me so much was the way Kyle had changed his daily habits. He talked about reading ingredient labels before buying food. He eliminated foods that no longer fit his health goals. He began preparing homemade bone broth, paying closer attention to nutrition, and becoming more aware of the environmental and dietary factors that could influence his health. And to me, that's one of the most rewarding parts of this kind of work. It's not simply about improving laboratory findings, it's about helping someone regain confidence in their ability to participate in their own recovery. Kyle's progress wasn't defined by one supplement or one protocol or one laboratory result. It came from understanding the patterns affecting his health, making thoughtful changes over time, and consistently supporting the biological systems that need the most attention. That's what this case was really about. One thing I want people to understand is that Kyle didn't receive a protocol on day one and simply follow it until the end. As his body responded, the plan evolved. Some priorities remained the same, such as supporting digestion, improving nutrient status, reducing unnecessary environmental exposures, and strengthening the body's ability to heal. But other parts of the plan changed as new information became available and as his progress guided our decisions. That's one of the advantages of working from both laboratory data and regular follow-up visits. The laboratory tests tell me where to begin. The patient tells me where to go next. When Kyle developed the herniated disc, for example, that became an entirely new challenge. Instead of ignoring it or pretending recovery always follows a straight line, we adapted the plan to account for what his body was dealing with at that point in time. And this is why I don't believe in one-size-fits-all protocols. The goal isn't to fit the patient into a program. The goal is to continually adjust the program to fit the patient. Throughout Kyle's case, every recommendation served a purpose. Some supported digestion, some helped nutrient availability, some focused on reducing the burden from environmental exposures, but others supported recovery, resilience, and the body's ability to adapt. No single recommendation was expected to do anything or everything. It was the combination and the willingness to adjust that combination over time that gave Kyle the best opportunity to make meaningful progress. Not every case study has laboratory findings, but usually every case has a treatment plan. Ultimately, what matters most is how the patient experiences the journey. When I spoke with Kyle, one thing became very clear. He wasn't just describing physical improvements. He was describing a different outlook on his health. He had begun to understand how the different pieces fit together and how the choices he made could either support or interfere with his progress. And for me, that's one of the most meaningful outcomes of working with people. Yes, I want to see improvements in symptoms. Yes, I want to see better laboratory findings. But I also want people to leave with a better understanding of their own bodies and the confidence to make informed decisions about their health. As we come to the end of Kyle's story, I hope you've noticed something. This case wasn't really about xenoestrogens. They were simply the beginning of the investigation. The laboratory findings helped us ask better questions. The gut zoomer helped us understand how his digestive system was functioning. His progress reports helped us evaluate whether our decisions were moving him in the right direction. And together, those pieces allowed us to build a plan that was individualized to Kyle rather than based on assumptions. One of the biggest lessons from this case is that chronic symptoms rarely exist in isolation. Fatigue, brain fog, digestive problems, weight gain, they may appear unrelated, but they're often connected by underlying biological patterns. Those patterns aren't always obvious. Sometimes they require looking beyond routine testing and taking the time to understand the whole person. Kyle's story is one example of what that process can look like. Not because every patient has the same findings and not because every patient follows the same path, but because asking better questions often leads to better answers. So thank you for joining me as I shared Kyle's story. If you'd like to learn more about the biological patterns that can influence chronic health problems and how functional laboratory testing can help uncover them, I invite you to subscribe and join me in future videos. Bye for now.